Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. It's just noon. Today we're going to have our another lunch and learn session. This lunch and learn series we've been holding monthly, and it looks like you all are attending these very well, so we appreciate that. For those of you who don't know me or recognize me, I'm Amy DeCook. I'm the in-house legal counsel here at NDSBA. And today we're going to focus on superintendent evaluation. And we schedule it during February for a reason, because we have just under a month for all of our boards to complete the required evaluation before March 15th. And so we thought this was about the latest we could get to this topic for it to be useful for you this spring. So having said that, just a little disclaimer. I'm sure you guys are used to me saying this by now, but I do need to mention it. All of the information that we're going to, that I'm going to provide today and in response to any questions or comments is for informational purposes only and is not intended as legal advice. If you do need direct legal advice or assistance, please feel free to contact your district legal counsel. So before we get into the details of superintendent evaluation, I think it's really important to discuss why superintendent evaluation is so important. This might be obvious to a lot of people, but actually I think understanding why it's so important will help guide you through the process. Well, before I move on, I forgot to mention you are all going to be muted throughout the session today. But I would welcome any questions that you have throughout the presentation, and I'll try to answer them as we go along. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen in order to ask questions. And then if you have any problems in terms of volume or anything of that nature, please use the chat feature to communicate with me and our staff on that issue. So let's keep it moving here. Why is the superintendent evaluation process so important? And kind of the first and most obvious reason is that your superintendent is your top employee. He or she is your chief executive officer in terms of the operations of the district. Your superintendent is charged with advising the board on various matters that are important to the district. He or she is responsible for implementing the vision of the board, making sure that all of the board policies and procedures are enforced and are being monitored and all of that. So the superintendent plays a significant role in the success of the district and for pursuing student improvement. So the process is very important for that reason. And in terms of the board's responsibility, evaluation of your superintendent is one of the primary responsibilities of the board. Kind of up there with setting board policy, setting the vision of the district. Your evaluation of your superintendent is one of your most important responsibilities as a board. If you have a well-oiled superintendent evaluation process, it can really do a lot to drive student improvement. I think I have school improvement there, but what I'm really getting at is student improvement. Having a great relationship with your superintendent and evaluating your superintendent effectively will lead to increases in student improvement, which is what we are all here for at the end of the day. So a couple of other things that a quality evaluation process, a superintendent evaluation process will do is it will go a long way in developing positive board superintendent relationships. And I will tell you from my experience here at NDSBA, once that relationship between the board and the superintendent starts to erode, a lot of not so good things can happen. And so anything that you can do to build a positive relationship between the board and the superintendent is key to the success of the district and ultimately to the success of your staff and your students. And then another thing that the evaluation process can do is it can clarify the roles and responsibilities, mainly between the board and the superintendent. So what lane should the board be in and what lane should the superintendent be in? The process helps identify that, or at least reinforce the different roles and responsibilities between those two groups. It can also provide an opportunity for the board and the superintendent to discuss the direction of the district on an ongoing basis. And so it allows for those discussions, back and forth discussions, so that you guys are all on the same page. In terms of where the district is going, what improvements need to be made, what changes need to be made, how well things are working, those types of things. And then finally, a quality evaluation process will also provide the public with accountability and transparency in terms of, is the district and the superintendent working together to, make students have the best possible chance for achieving the goals that they want to do and getting the education that they need. It gives the public that viewpoint as well. We often I think of superintendent evaluations and frankly, other employee evaluations as an opportunity to address concerns or to utilize in the event that you have to non-renew a superintendent or other certified staff member or terminate in some circumstances. But really, that is not the primary goal of the evaluation process. The evaluation process is most effective when it is designed and used to improve existing performance and then provide a dialogue about future expectations. It can't and shouldn't be only for punitive reasons or even for reviewing past performance. It really should be a forward-looking, what's going on now, how are things going on now, and then what can we expect or what do we want to build on in the future. That should be kind of the mindset that the board and the superintendent have when you're going through the evaluation process. In terms of benefits to the board, the evaluation process provides several, and I've listed a few here, but I haven't identified all of them, but these are kind of the key ones. It allows you as board members to follow the progress of your school district. That should be one of the things that you're getting out of that evaluation process and the information that your superintendent is providing to you. It also allows you to check in on what your superintendent is doing in terms of continuing their professional development and building on skills and making improvements. Even if they're doing a fantastic job, it's we can always continue to grow and improve and build skills. So it gives you that that look into what they're doing in terms of professional development. It allows you as board members to provide input and feedback and support for your superintendent. Let them know how well they're doing in certain areas, and then also maybe where they could build some skills and where you want them to focus for the upcoming school year. And again, I kind of mentioned this already in terms of building a solid superintendent board relationship, and this kind of gets to that as well, but it creates that environment of trust and collaboration between the superintendent and board. Once that trust is eroded, that again can lead to not so great things happening. And in my experience, it seems to kind of start out small, and if it's not addressed either through an effective evaluation process or through communication, if a problem arises, communication between the parties, it can really start to erode that trust, and it starts to snowball. And if you don't put the work in to bring that back into the positive side of things, it almost always ends in a parting of ways, and it doesn't usually happen overnight. Again, it snowballs, and then it starts to have a negative impact on the environment in the school district, and ultimately potentially on student success. And then again, it also provides the ability of the board to oversee and make sure that your vision that you've set, the policies that you've adopted, and the procedures that you've adopted are being followed, not just by the superintendent, but also by the rest of the staff and students, because your superintendent is ultimately responsible for implementing those policies and procedures that you've put into place. So one of the key things for evaluation, it's hard. I mean, evaluations are, at least to some extent, inherently subjective, because it's individuals that are evaluating another individual. But there should still be a goal to build objectivity and fairness into the process, even though we recognize that there will always kind of be some degree of subjectivity. So how do we go about being as objective and as fair as we can in terms of the evaluation process? So a couple of things that you can use in terms of tools and procedures. I wanted to give you a few tips on that. So the first one is using additional documentation, and I'm not referring to just the evaluation instrument. I'm referring to underlying supporting documentation that can help you evaluate your superintendent, for your superintendent to provide you additional information as to how things are going in the district. So that's what I'm referring to in terms of documentation. Some of the types of documentation that you could use are existing reports that your superintendent provides to you on the status of the district. So looking to those reports, bringing those into the evaluation process to help you evaluate, be more than just a checklist of areas that you're checking off as you go through your evaluation instrument. You want to look at some of that supporting documentation. And I think before, it's good to have a mutually agreeable, so the board and the superintendent agree on what that supporting documentation would be. So having that agreed upon at the outset, so that the superintendent knows what the board will want to see and be able to provide that information to the board. So a couple of things. So annual reports, if there's some kind of curriculum studies that you could look at, if there are budget items, print out some reports that you want to provide, those types of things. And it can vary. And I think, you want to tailor it to your needs in your particular district. The other thing to think about that I think will build some objectivity and fairness into the process is looking at the criteria on which you're rating your superintendent, and then what the ratings are. And again, I think it's helpful for the superintendent and the board to sit down. If you're hiring a new superintendent, it's a good time to do that at the outset of employment. Or if you've had a superintendent with your district for a while and you haven't done some of these things, sit down with them at the beginning, in the late summer, early fall, whatever is most convenient to you. And we'll talk in a bit about a suggested timeline on all of this. But it's good to sit down, even if your superintendent has been with you for a while. If you've never kind of talked about these things, I think it's a good thing to do. Everybody being on the same page, I don't think is ever a bad thing. So sitting down with them and talking about the various areas or criteria upon which you're going to be evaluating them, and get their thoughts on that, so that hopefully you can come to a mutual agreement on that. Ultimately, the board gets to decide what the criteria is. So if you can't come to an agreement, ultimately the board can decide, but I think it's best to try to come to an agreement on that. But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing in terms of the criteria and the ratings that you're going to be using to evaluate is making sure that everybody understands them, that they're actually realistic criteria and ratings to utilize, and that they are measurable. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're doing. You're measuring progress, you're measuring performance. Another effective tool for an objective and fair evaluation are written comments and feedback. Again, the evaluation process should not simply be a checklist that you go through briefly twice a year. It should be a dynamic process, kind of a back and forth discussion between the board and the superintendent. And a big important part of that is providing written comments and written feedback and recommendations for improvement or skill building. Written comments and feedback can offer that specific constructive, and I'll say that word again, constructive praise and criticism. You can have constructive criticism, and in the evaluation process, that's part of it too, is not just letting them know where they're doing well, but also where they can continue to improve or build, or frankly, if they are falling behind expectations, you want to note that in the evaluation process. And so written comments are important. And then regardless of what rating you're getting, giving your superintendent in various areas that you're evaluating them on, even if they are performing satisfactorily, it's important to still provide that written feedback. And I constantly bring this up when I chat with board members who give me a call about superintendent evaluations, is not just to give them a rating, but to give them that written specific feedback. That's incredibly important. And then another thing, I'm not quite sure how often this is happening. I'm sure that this is happening in districts throughout North Dakota already, but I am certain that this is not happening in a lot of districts as well. I think having what I've called evaluation conferences throughout your evaluation process is important. Not just having that one meeting right before the board is going to meet to finalize the evaluation document. I'm talking about kind of ongoing throughout the school year or evaluation period, having those conferences between the board and the superintendent, checking in with them on how they're doing with their goals. And we'll get to that in a little bit as in terms of a timeline, but those face-to-face meetings are important. Sometimes that can be in front of the whole board, or sometimes that can be just the board president and the superintendent. But if it is just the board president and the superintendent, the board should be giving some direction as to how they would like the board president to approach those meetings as well. And so those evaluation conferences, I think, are an important piece to really building a good evaluation, a quality evaluation process. And during those conferences, you can talk about establishing goals, talk about the evaluation instrument that you're going to be using. Does it need to be tweaked, or does some criteria need to be changed? It allows for those discussions to happen. So before you run off and say, okay, we're gonna do our March 15th evaluation, I think we got it covered. I still think there's a couple of things that I would like to remind you of or inform you of that I think will really help you in the future going through the evaluation process. So I kind of picked out 5 different things that I think are important to do essentially every evaluation cycle. And so probably most important first thing that you should do is to actually develop an evaluation timeline. And we'll get to that in a bit, but, and I'm going to provide a suggested timeline, but again, it's not just something that you think about twice a year. So in November and then again in March. This is something that you should develop a timeline throughout the year, every year, so that you can track progress, so that you can discuss goals, and that it'll make the actual evaluation, when you're approving the evaluation and going through that individually as board members, it'll make that much easier. Another thing to do is to create a superintendent's job description if you don't have one, or be reviewing that on a frequent basis, so that you can make sure that it's up to date, that it accurately reflects your expectations in terms of what your superintendent should be doing. Another key piece is reviewing your superintendent's contract to make sure that there's not something additional that you should be factoring into the evaluation process in terms of what might be set forth in their contract. Treating the evaluation as a goal-based evaluation. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in a bit. And then finally, I think a piece that kind of gets left out in a lot of districts is encouraging your superintendent to engage in self-evaluation. And we'll chat about that in a bit. Okay, so first, we're going to talk about developing an evaluation timeline. So the first thing to keep in mind when you're developing an evaluation timeline is to know what the basic requirements are in terms of superintendent evaluation under North Dakota law. Those requirements are found in section 15.1-14-03. And in terms of timeline, there are essentially two things to remember. You have to complete an evaluation of your superintendent every year on or before November 15th. And that means the board must approve and adopt the evaluation by that date. And I think for this evaluation, most of the time it's treated as a formative evaluation, you know, more goal setting, those types of things. And then the second evaluation must be completed on or before March 15th. And that's more of a summative evaluation. Now, just to be clear, North Dakota law does not distinguish the two evaluations as formative versus summative, but I think that's, in a best practice or a good practice. And I think a lot of districts treat their evaluations of their superintendent in that way. And then again, it shouldn't just be something that you think about just, you know, once in the fall and then again in the late winter. Your evaluation of your superintendent should be ongoing. And it's helpful, I think, to accomplish that by developing a timeline. And I've found a 12-month timeline that I thought can work really well. But again, this is something that every district, every board can develop on its own. So here's, I wanted to go through my suggested 12-month evaluation timeline that I found, that I thought was a really good one to utilize. But again, you guys can decide within your own district what might be appropriate. So in this suggested timeline, again, it's kind of a 12-month evaluation timeline. It would begin in the summer, early fall, where you would, you know, do such things like reviewing that superintendent job description, or if you don't have one, creating that job description. And we have a suggested superintendent job description on our website. So if you need help getting to that, let me know and we can direct you there. The other thing you should be looking at and reviewing, I think every evaluation cycle, is that evaluation instrument that you've been utilizing. We also have a template evaluation instrument that we have attached. And I think it's a good form instrument to start with, but I think you should really think about if it's something that is going to work for your district, and having that discussion with your superintendent at the start of every evaluation cycle is a good thing. Making sure it's still continuing to work for you and giving you the things that you need in terms of evaluating your superintendent. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is identifying the appropriate evaluation documentation and data that you want to use to measure your superintendent's performance in the various areas that you'll be evaluating him or her on. And so identifying that documentation and data early on in the timeline is important. And I just want to reiterate, this it shouldn't just be a unilateral undertaking by the board. This should be a collaborative discussion that's happening with your superintendent. And frankly, your superintendent can provide a lot of these things to you so that, give you all of this information for you to make an informed decision. And then, every evaluation cycle, creating measurable goals that are in line with your district's goals. That should be goal setting. A goal-based evaluation is, I think, a really effective way to evaluate your superintendent. Give them goals for the, for over the next 12 months in this case, that you'll be evaluating him or her against. And we'll talk about goals more in a bit. And then in the late fall, early winter, you may want to encourage your superintendent to complete a self-evaluation and to provide you with, as a board, with some mid-year progress report on those goals that you talked about at the outset of the evaluation cycle. And then this is the time where you're going to be completing that formative early winter evaluation, which again, under North Dakota law is required to be completed on or before November 15th. And so in terms of that process, each board member completes their individual evaluation form where they rate the superintendent, they provide written feedback. And then once you have that complete as an individual board member, you provide that typically to your board president. And then the board president takes all of that information and incorporates it into one summary evaluation document. And then we recommend at NDSBA that the board president, once you have that summary document prepared, that you meet with the superintendent to have kind of a preliminary discussion on where the board is going in terms of evaluating at that particular time. The board, it's not a finalized document. It hasn't been adopted by the board, but I do think it's important to meet with the superintendent before the board meets to finalize and approve that evaluation. Give your superintendent an opportunity to provide some feedback or answer questions, or maybe ask questions about maybe some of the ratings or the comments that are in place. I would be remiss if I didn't mention or just didn't remind you all to just, whenever you're having these discussions outside of a board meeting, to make sure that you are complying with open meetings requirements. A meeting between the board president and a superintendent, just those two individuals, will typically not implicate any open meetings issues. But if your superintendent is reaching out to various board members, that could create some open meetings issues. So just to be aware of that. And if you have any questions on that, please feel free to give me a call and I can provide information to you on that. I want to, before I continue, I just want to mention that many boards adopt our template policy on superintendent evaluation, and our template kind of outlines a process that in terms of individual board members completing the evaluation form all the way through adopting a final evaluation by the board. I'm not sure if our template mentions meeting with the superintendent. I know that districts do that already, which is good. I think, again, even if your template policy, your policy doesn't mention that meeting, I think it's an important thing to do as a courtesy to your superintendent before the board meets to finalize and approve the evaluation. So once that Once that meeting occurs, and it doesn't have to be real formal, it's just an opportunity to let the superintendent know, okay, here's what the preliminary evaluation, summary evaluation document looks like, and kind of gives the superintendent a heads up as to what might be discussed at the meeting. And then the board would schedule a meeting that's properly noticed, accessible by the public, and open to the public, where they will meet to discuss, finalize, and approve that evaluation before that November 15th deadline. And then once that occurs, you would give the final copy to the superintendent and then place a copy in the superintendent's personnel file. So that's kind of what the late fall, winter would look like in this suggested time frame. So going forward on the suggested timeline, in the late winter, kind of early spring, we would then have the second evaluation coming forward. And again, each board member would be completing a summative evaluation form on the superintendent and then providing that to the board president, who then creates a summative evaluation summary on the evaluation instrument used by the board. Again, the board president should meet with the superintendent to have that preliminary discussion before the board then meets in an open meeting, properly noticed, to finalize and complete that summative evaluation. And then again, you provide a final copy of the you provide a copy of the final evaluation to your superintendent and place a copy in his or her personnel file. And then late spring, early summer, I don't know why I have summary on there. That's supposed to be summer. You would start the process all over again. So again, this is just kind of a timeline, a suggested timeline over a 12-month period to kind of help you as a board guide you through that process on a yearly basis. Because again, it's an ongoing process. It's not just something to think about once or excuse me, twice every school year. It should be an ongoing process. Okay, so again, another important thing to do before you, go through your evaluation process is to create, if you don't have one, or review your job description for your superintendent. And just a couple of things that a good job description should have is it needs to clearly define what your expectations are and your expected duties of your superintendent are. And again, this should be a collaborative discussion, like having your superintendent provide feedback as well. They're your education experts, so they're going to know, much more about the day-to-day management of the district and providing educational services, that responsibility. They're going to know more about that typically than the board members will do. And so having that collaboration is important. And then it also gives you the opportunity to have that common understanding so that everybody's on the same page before you even begin the year. This is what we expect of you. It just provides that foundation for a common understanding. Another place to look for kind of what is expected of school district superintendents in North Dakota is section 15.1-1401. That lists the various statutory duties of the superintendent. And I'm just going to pull that up here on my, excuse me, hold on here. Oops, let's resume share. Sorry, I was going to pull it up on my my screen, but it ended up being kind of interrupted my my presentation. So I'm not going to do that because I don't want to lose my presentation place. But it's helpful to go back to that section if you haven't looked at it recently and just review those statutory obligations. And again, they're kind of those high-level CEO type responsibilities in terms of K-12 education and school district management. So nothing surprising, but they're quite broad and again, high-level responsibilities. Those should help guide you in creating and reviewing your job description. you should tailor it to address your specific needs. Not every superintendent does the same thing in every district, especially if we're talking about, a smaller district versus a large district. The functions and duties of a superintendent are very different, or can be very different depending on from district to district. Again, I think going back and, don't just create a job description and then never look at it again. I think it's, things evolve, and I think it's important to go back and look at that. And I think, again, at least every evaluation cycle is helpful to make sure that it's still adequate. An accurate, clearly defined job description is helpful, in not just in the evaluation process, but, at contract negotiation time, it's important because, again, it provides everybody with a description of what is expected of the superintendent. It can also help if there's ever an issue that arises. It defines what their responsibilities are. And so if they are deficient in those responsibilities and a situation arises, it's documentation that gives you an idea, okay, what are there that's in your job description. So if you're not carrying out that function, then that's a problem, and the job description helps in that type of a thing as well. You'll want to make sure that that job description is consistent with your expectations as a board, and I think if you're revisiting that frequently, then you're going to make sure that that's the case. And again, we have a sample job description on our website if you want to take a look at that. Okay, so I've mentioned a few times today that having a goals-based evaluation is really important. In establishing those and hopefully mutually agreeable goals at the outset of the evaluation cycle each year is important. And here's a couple of things that in terms of establishing those goals, that you should do and that you should avoid doing. So on the things that you should do in terms of goals-based evaluations is to collaborate. And I've said this a couple of different times, but when you're establishing those goals at the outset of the evaluation process, having that collaboration on the process, timeline, and what the expectations are in terms of how those goals, how you're going to progress, how your superintendent is going to progress through the year on accomplishing those goals, having that collaborative discussion at the outset is important. It really goes a long way to ensuring, or at least giving a really good opportunity for your superintendent to succeed at meeting those goals. Again, agreeing on one final evaluation form by the board. And what I'm getting at here is you want to avoid individual evaluations. At the end of the day, the evaluation it's one evaluation from the board. And so the board is going to speak in one voice. And so making sure that you're approving that one final evaluation form that is acceptable to the board as a whole and is speaking, it's the voice of the board that's speaking and not individual board members. Making sure that your superintendent and the board are on the same page, and that goes kind of throughout the process, no matter what area or part of the process you're talking about. Having the board and the superintendent on the same page as much as possible is important. Having a discussion about what the ratings are going to be. I know that in most districts, their evaluation instrument has ratings of satisfactory versus unsatisfactory. That might work in a lot of districts, and I think that's a good way to do it. But that doesn't always give the clear picture. I think sometimes the thought is, well, you rated me as satisfactory, so why are you providing me with recommendations or areas of improvement, or where you think I'm falling behind? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't jive. Or there's the, there's this kind of this understanding that if you're rating satisfactory, that kind of ends the discussion. So again, even when you're rating somebody as satisfactory, it's hard to know where on the spectrum that's falling. Is it just just over the line of satisfactory, or is it, they're doing a stellar job, they're really excelling? It's hard to know, and that's where written feedback can really provide some of that underlying context. But the other thing that you can do, if you feel like it's a good thing in your district, is you can use different ratings. I've seen an evaluation instrument that has kind of 4 levels of rating. And so it gives a little bit more context to where you think your superintendent is in a given area. So that's something that you can do. It's perfectly acceptable for you to do something different. And again, I would say one of the things that most boards trip up on is they don't give themselves enough time to discuss the evaluation and for the superintendent to provide input before the evaluation deadline comes up and you have to finalize it. That's probably the biggest thing that I see as far as the calls that I'm getting is, oh gosh, we want to get a meeting scheduled, but we have 3 board members that are unavailable. What do we do? We're going to miss the deadline. And then it's a rushed process. And then it's not just, we're not going to meet the deadline. It's also, well, maybe you're rushing through it, or you're not giving your superintendent an opportunity to provide some input on the evaluation process. So that's kind of something that you need to make sure you're doing, is allowing sufficient time to get all of it done. And then make sure that you're being guided by your policies. So when you're setting goals, when you're reviewing progress against those goals, consider the policies that you've adopted. That'll be very helpful in helping you judge whether you're a goals-based evaluation. And then on the other side, and some of these mirror the do's, but some of the don'ts is, not having that collaborative process and expecting either the board or the superintendent to kind of handle the process on their own. And I've seen it both ways, where kind of the superintendent, drives the process and, is the one handing out the evaluation forms, gathering those, incorporating them into a final document, scheduling the meeting, reaching out to the board president to get feedback. I think, again, there can be some of that, but I think it shouldn't be all or nothing. And I see it again on the other side too, where the board kind of drives the process and doesn't include the superintendent. And that's, I think, just not a good way to do it. It doesn't serve the primary purpose, which is to, provide feedback, review existing performance, set expectations for the future, and to really drive, at the end of the day, student and school improvement. Providing separate evaluations from each board member. I hope this isn't happening, but I think sometimes it does, making sure that you understand that the evaluation form that you ultimately adopt as a board shouldn't be essentially a culmination of individual evaluations. It is, at the end of the day, an evaluation by the board, and that's how it should be treated. And so discussing individual, if there's a discrepancy in the ratings amongst board members, the board needs to discuss that discrepancy and resolve that discrepancy by discussion and a vote. And then once that is voted on, that becomes the rating of the board. And that also applies to written feedback. Oftentimes the board president will incorporate individual comments from board members into the final, preliminary final document that will be discussed at the meeting. But it's important to know that once that evaluation form is adopted by the board, if you leave those individual board member comments in, those now become comments of the board as a whole. And so if you don't agree with some of those other comments made by other individual board members, you should resolve that at that meeting before you finalize the evaluation document. I see I have some questions. Okay. Okay, so one of the questions is, our board has typically had each board member complete the evaluation, and then the board president compiles them all on one master evaluation. So that's typical and that's recommended. So we could have 3 excellent, 2 satisfactory, and 1 poor on the final evaluation. So you see here in this district, they actually have 3 different rating categories. Should the board come together as one voice of where the superintendent rates, or is it appropriate to give them all these different ratings in a given area? I would say, again, at most boards adopt a policy on superintendent evaluation, and those policies require the board to resolve any discrepancies amongst individual board members in terms of ratings in a given area. And so you wouldn't typically want to have an evaluation form that's finalized by the board that has 3 different ratings for one given area. You need to resolve that discrepancy. And in fact, North Dakota law requires that. And that's again found in section 15.1-1403. It specifically requires that if there is a discrepancy amongst ratings, it has to be resolved by the board. And the way that this is resolved, and I will get to this process in a bit, but I'll mention it here since we're on topic. But the way that's resolved is by roll call vote. You have a discussion, you discuss it as a board, and then you vote on the rating. So, in the majority rules in terms of what the rating ultimately will be. Oh, looks like I already answered that question, but I think it's an important question just to kind of reiterate. It looks like I'm hearing from, this is a comment and question by a superintendent, and he says, I do like hearing the comments from individual board members. Currently, they are included on the evaluation. I understand why you recommend against that. Can those comments still be shared with the superintendent outside of the approved evaluation document? Absolutely. So that kind of reinforces that meeting before the board meets to finalize the evaluation. That meeting between the superintendent and the board president is so important because it gives the superintendent the opportunity to review the individual ratings, to see the individual comments, and then be prepared for the board discussion at the meeting. So I think it's important. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is for board members in particular, is that those individual board member evaluations are open records in addition to the final evaluation document. So, you may have some retention, you may have a retention policy in terms of how long you retain those individual board member evaluations, but if they are retained by the district, they are going to typically be open records. And so it gives you should be sharing that with your your superintendent, but you also should know, it's not just speaking to your superintendent, you may be speaking to any member of the public. So just keep that in mind whenever you're completing those evaluations. Another question from a board member. So do we rate and approve each area, not just the evaluation as a whole? That is correct. It is not recommended to give your superintendent an overall rating. You should be rating them in specific areas and rating them in that area. So you don't give them an overall satisfactory or unsatisfactory. You would rate them in those given areas, and you would clear up any discrepancies amongst individual board members in those given areas. And so the board essentially would be giving a rating for each area that you're evaluating your superintendent on. So great question so far. And then just to finish out some of the don'ts, providing ratings only and not providing any written feedback or commentary. I just don't think that's particularly helpful. I think it just kind of diminishes the evaluation process, and it doesn't really accomplish the primary purpose of the evaluation. Appointing a committee to handle the evaluation. I don't want to say that you can never create a committee to kind of do complete some of these functions, like that collaboration between the superintendent and the board. Having a committee, creating a committee to kind of do some of the heavy lifting on that is okay. But at the end of the day, it is still a board function. And so not setting goals, agreeing on an evaluation instrument, agreeing on supporting documentation, and then actually completing the evaluation, those are all things that the board should still do. You shouldn't delegate that away to a committee. Okay. It looks like we have something in the chat. And then it's easier to put the questions in the Q&A because then I can keep them all straight, but it's fine. I got this last question from a superintendent. What happens if an evaluation that's approved has both the superintendent should find a new job and the superintendent does an outstanding job as comments? That's a unique situation. So basically you have, those must be individual comments coming from the board, from individual board members. That kind of reinforces why not just including individual board member comments on the evaluation process, or excuse me, on the evaluation form is you know, not a good idea to do that. Because you can have that inconsistency, and then it sends a mixed message to your superintendent. Again, the whole point of the evaluation is to have the board speak in one voice. Sometimes that might mean that it's just the majority of the board speaking because you may not have agreement, and that's okay. But in this type of example where you have inconsistent comments, including them both on the evaluation isn't particularly helpful. So you'll want to resolve that discrepancy by discussion and vote at your meeting. We have a couple more questions. Are the individual evaluation forms therefore filed along with the approved evaluation? I assume you mean maybe in the personnel file. I wouldn't recommend including individual board member evaluations along with the final evaluation in personnel file, because those individual board member evaluations are not the approved board evaluation. You can retain them somewhere else. It doesn't mean that they're not open records, but I think in terms of what goes in the superintendent's personnel file, it should only be the final document that is approved by the board. Next question, to be clear, you recommend that no comments be included on the final approved evaluation if they come from an individual board member. So to be clear, I think it's important to remember that comments, feedback, written recommendations in the final document, if approved by the board, even if they came from individual board members, they ultimately, if it's approved by the board, they are comments, written feedback, recommendations by the board. And so the board, they can essentially be used against you. So, you know, that's why you want to make sure that you're discussing those. And then if you're including them in the final evaluation that's approved by the board, they become board comments, board written feedback, board recommendations. And so you should be discussing those at the meeting. And if the board votes not to include that on the final evaluation form, then it's not included. Another question. If the board comes together and we approve one final evaluation, why are there individual forms used to get the one evaluation subject to open records? That gets back to why, I think the point of it is, why are those individual forms open records if ultimately the board votes and approves one evaluation form? Because it just kind of gets back to our open records policies and laws in North Dakota. Any record maintained by a public entity is subject to the open records requirements. And, you know, the default is that all records are open. So if the district maintains those individual board member evaluation forms, and somebody from the public requests them, they are going to be open records. I'm not aware of any exception to, again, the default rule that all records are open that would apply to those individual forms. So that's, again, why it's important as board members to really keep that in mind when you're completing those forms. Comments and things that you put on those could be seen by members of the public, and it could be something that could form the basis of a claim against the district if they're defamatory or untrue, those kinds of things. So it's always good to keep that in mind. I hope that's clear. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have so far. So I'm going to move on to the next thing. And so we've talked a lot about having goals-based evaluations. And so a key piece of that is, I'm just going to clear out some of this here. A key piece of having a goals-based evaluation is to establish those goals. And so how do you go about doing that? Okay, give me 2 seconds. Okay, so in terms of establishing goals, I think it's important, again, it's a collaborative process between the board and the superintendent. And you shouldn't be too eager to establish a bunch of goals. Every evaluation cycle, again, if you're following the suggested timeline that I talked about before, it would be kind of the summer, early fall timeframe. You want to sit down with your superintendent, likely at a meeting with the board, and agree on kind of overall school district goals and then superintendent professional development goals. So what can the superintendent do in terms of professional development? And then the school district goals is what the board then would expect the superintendent to work towards in terms of progress over the evaluation cycle. So we would generally recommend that you agree on at least 2 school district goals, but don't go more than 3. I think that starts to get a little onerous, and I think unrealistic if you're going more than 3, but you should have at least 2. And then in terms of your superintendent professional development goals, having at least 1, but not more than 2. Again, keeping that realistic, giving your superintendent the opportunity to actually achieve those goals over the evaluation period is important. So not getting too carried away with goal setting is important. As always, student improvement, school improvement should be directing your goal setting. So always keeping that should always be your underlying, everything. It should underline all of your goal setting. And then again, making sure that the goals that you're setting are measurable, or it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be accomplished in a 12-month evaluation period or cycle, but that you can measure progress against those goals over that 12-month period. So again, doesn't need to be completed or achieved, but you should be able to measure progress, over that 12-month period. So again, keep that in mind when you're setting those goals. And then again, when it should be a collaborative process, hopefully you can come to mutual agreement with your board, with your superintendent on what those goals will be, and also how are you going to measure progress over the evaluation time period, and what are you going to look at to measure that progress. So sitting down with your superintendent and agreeing on that when possible is important. Okay, we got a couple more questions here before I move on. This meeting where all of this discussion is taking place needs to be open to the public. Question, does it have to be a separate meeting, or can it be part of our monthly meeting? So the first question, yes. Anytime a quorum or more of the board meets, it's a meeting, and so it needs to be properly noticed, open to the public. There would be no basis typically in North Dakota law to close a meeting for purposes of superintendent evaluation. That is going to be one of the key things that is open to the public in terms of school board functions. And so there really isn't going to be an ability, I don't think, in any circumstances to close the meeting. Does it have to be a separate meeting, or can it be part of our monthly meeting? I think it can be either. There's not anything in North Dakota law that would require you to schedule a special meeting, but I think the key is to make sure that you have sufficient amount of time on your agenda to have a robust discussion if that's necessary. And there should be some discussion every evaluation. There shouldn't just be, again, the board moves to approve and no discussion. There should be some discussion. I don't think if you're not having discussion, I question whether you're really if you have a robust, effective evaluation process. I think you can you get a lot of benefit from that discussion as a board. So retain individual forms for open records, but file elsewhere and filed by the district versus filed privately by the board member. Another question on comments: are they just compiled separately for discussion at the meeting? Is the final evaluation filled out during the meeting or prior to? So it's a lot of questions. So I'll try to unpack that. There's nothing in North Dakota law that requires the board or the district to maintain or retain those individual board member evaluations for a certain period of time. They're, generally speaking, I think good practice is to retain, certainly retain those individual forms until the board finalizes the evaluation of that superintendent. But that's going to vary from district to district. Oftentimes school districts boards will adopt a retention schedule. And so you'll want to look at what your retention schedule says. But even if, let's just say, even if it's in individual board members' possession, it's a board doc, it's a school district record, and they're an agent of the school district. So even if it's in the board member's sole possession, it's still likely subject to an open records request. And so, if your business manager receives an open records request from somebody saying, I want copies of all of the individual board members' evaluations from last evaluation for our superintendent, your business manager is going to be calling your individual board members and asking for those documents if they have them. And if they are in existence and you still have them, you're going to have to turn them over and provide them to the person who requested. Is the final evaluation document filled out during the meeting or prior to? So most of board policies require the board president to take the individual board members and evaluations, compile them into one essentially master evaluation form. And then the board so that part is completed prior to the meeting. And then at the meeting, you're resolving discrepancies, you're finalizing written comments and feedback. And so it might be revised during the meeting before it's ultimately approved by the board. Let's see. What is the required period of time to keep the individual evaluation forms if it's not outlined in policy? Can policy be whatever the board desires? Can it be retroactive? So again, I kind of talked about this already, but just to reiterate, there's nothing in the law that speaks directly to how long those individual evaluation forms need to be kept. So the board has flexibility to determine that. Most boards, again, adopt retention schedules. And so you'll want to look at your retention schedule if you have one to see if it speaks to that specifically. I'm just going to move on to the next slide because we're running close to our time, and I'll get back to questions here in a second. But I wanted to cover a couple of common pitfalls that I get most of the time. Most of the calls I'm getting are on these issues, and so these are things to just be aware of, making sure that you're not kind of falling prey to these pitfalls. Again, the easiest one to avoid is failing to meet those statutory requirements. Those are minimum should be viewed as minimum requirements, and you should strive to go above and beyond those requirements in terms of building a more robust evaluation process. So simply failing to meet those minimum requirements is something to avoid. That's kind of the easiest thing to avoid, I think. So making sure that you're aware when those deadlines are coming up, not just waiting for a week or two before, getting those evaluation forms to your individual board members in time so that they have enough time to complete that. Your board president can compile them, and you guys can be prepared for the discussion that's going to be happening at the meeting all before those statutory deadlines come. Only meeting those minimum statutory requirements. That, I think, is something you should work to avoid. It should be a more robust evaluation process. It really goes a long way to increasing student improvement. Failing to identify clear goals and progress indicators. So we just talked about developing and establishing those goals on a yearly basis, and so not having those clear so that both the superintendent and the board are on the same page, and then agreeing to how you're going to measure that progress towards those goals throughout the evaluation cycle. Having that done and identifying that at the outset is important. Assuming that superintendent evaluation is just about whether you're going to renew their contract or you're going to terminate their contract. That is a purpose for evaluation, but it is not the primary purpose. It's really about building that relationship between board and superintendent, giving feedback, identifying goals, expectations, and allowing for continuous improvement of your school district. Another one to avoid: delegating the evaluation to one board member or to a committee of board members. That's just not, it's not the best way to do that. Again, an individual board member really has no authority to speak on behalf of the board. You are elected as part of a governing body, so making sure you're acting as a unit, as a cohesive, to the extent possible, a cohesive unit is important, not to delegate away that important responsibility. And then making the evaluation process a one-way process. So either, again, the superintendent is driving it and kind of doing all the work, or vice versa, the board is doing that and not involving the superintendent. Having that collaboration is really important. Okay, so we have still a couple of questions here, so I just want to clear out some that I've already answered. Okay, how about individual evaluations that are done by an electronic process? Are they open records? How should they be handled? Our open records requirements in North Dakota law are very clear. Electronically held records are included in records in terms of open records requirements. So even if they're handled or done electronically, which I know that a lot of districts do that, which is fine, but they're still open records. And so if you have the ability to access them and you're maintaining them on your server, or if individual board members have access to them, they're subject to open records requests. Good question. For schools that don't have board members complete the individual evaluations, how do you do it in an open board meeting? So one thing I would say here is that you should look to see if you have a superintendent evaluation policy adopted, because if you're using our template, your policy would require individual board members to complete the evaluation form. So if you're not doing that and you have that policy, you're not in compliance with your own policy. That is the best way to do it. It allows for thoughtful feedback, thoughtful decisions to be made by individual board members. And then once you get to the meeting, it doesn't, you can, jump into the discussion as a board to finalize and approve the evaluation, so that you're not spending a bunch of time getting, essentially hearing for the first time from individual board members. That's pretty time consuming. And so you shouldn't wait to the meeting to do all of that work. You should do some of that work before you get to that meeting. All right. How do you conduct evaluation conferences with the whole board in attendance? Would count as a meeting, but it can't be done privately with only the superintendent. That's correct. Having those evaluation conferences that I mentioned, kind of those face-to-face meetings throughout the evaluation cycle, I think are important. There's no hard and fast rules about how many to have, but I think having checking in with your superintendent especially on how they're progressing throughout those goals shouldn't just happen at those evaluation timelines when you're completing the evaluation. You should have those conferences hopefully throughout the year. So yes, it would be something that the board would have to, you couldn't have that conference outside of an open meeting. It would have to be in an open meeting and can't be closed. That looks like all of the questions that I have. I really appreciate the questions. It makes it, I like to hear from you and let you and figure out where some of the your questions are coming from, because that helps inform us and in providing some additional resources. So thank you so much for joining us today. Our next Lunch and Learn series will be on March 17th, again at noon. We're going to have an innovative education panel that's going to be moderated by State Superintendent Kirsten Basler, and she's going to be joined by, I think, a panel of 3 board members. They're going to talk about how they're implemented innovation education programs in their district. So really important discussion. If you need more information on that session or to register, go to our website under the resources tab, and then you can go to Lunch and Learn, and you can register there and get information. And then I believe we'll be posting my presentation as well as any other resource documents that we have on our website under the Lunch and Learn tab after probably, I'm not sure if it'll be this week, but for sure by next week. So look for that as well. And if you have any questions on anything that we talked about today, feel free to give me a call, and I can get you the information that you need. Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your attention, and enjoy the rest of your day.